This is the second part of the Cellular Level of Organization chapter material, focusing on the cytoplasm and organelles. The cytoplasm is usually thought of as the space between the nucleus and the cell membrane. The word itself basically means the stuff in the cell. Plasma is a very old term, coming from a Greek word that means to form or mold, and it's just what takes up the space between the nucleus and the cell membrane. Within the cytoplasm we find a number of major organelles that are important to the functioning of any cell. The cytoskeleton isn't really an organelle, it's the protein skeleton of the cell. It gives the cell its structure and has a lot to do with movement of cells. Sometimes only internal movement, as many cells don't have motility functions with them. The cytoskeleton is composed of a number of different proteins classified into three different types. The smallest of those is the microfilament, which is made up of a protein called actin. The largest is the microtubule, made up of a protein called tubulin. Those are found in all different types of cells, and then each cell type has its own particular intermediate fiber, and oftentimes those are named in relation to the cell, such as neurons have neurofilaments, while other cells have proteins with unique names, such as the epithelial cells of the skin have keratin. The cells are actually named after those as keratinocytes or keratinocytes. The main point of the cytoskeleton on the whole is to give cells their structure, and there are many processes that make use of the microtubules especially to move structures around within the cell. And for motile cells, like white blood cells, actin can be important in how it extends portions of the cell membrane out. As far as the cells that we're going to pay the most attention to the cytoskeleton in, it is in fact the epithelial cells and the neurons. When we get to talking about the white blood cells in ANP2, we won't necessarily talk about the cytoskeleton itself. And then in muscle cells, the cytoskeleton is adapted to a very specialized function which allows for contraction of the muscle tissue itself. The mitochondria is possibly one of the better known organelles in cells. You'll often hear reference to the mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell. That's become such a trite expression, it's lost a lot of meaning. A powerhouse is referring to part of a dam or some sort of structure that generates energy, and the powerhouse is part of that generation of energy. And in fact, that is what mitochondria are for. They take carbohydrates primarily, although lipids and amino acids can work into the system too, break them down and harvest energy out of them in the form mostly of electrons that's then used to produce the energy-rich molecule ATP. The process of taking the electrons and making ATP goes through a process called the electron transport chain, which is a series of proteins embedded in the inner membrane which pump hydrogen ions or protons from the matrix, the central part of the mitochondria, into the space between the inner and outer membranes, building up a concentration gradient, and the protons can only get out of that space and go down their concentration gradient when they move through the ATP synthase molecule, which makes use of the physical movement of those protons to attach a third phosphate group onto ADP, therefore making ATP. Muscle cells, as we talked about them in ANP1, use quite a bit of ATP, so we'll be considering that this semester. Neurons will also be important, as there are many energy-dependent processes there that we're interested in. But really all cells have and need ATP. The one significant exception to that is red blood cells. Mitochondria need oxygen to do their job, and so red blood cells, which carry oxygen, do not have mitochondria, therefore they won't be using up the oxygen that they carry for their own purposes. Endoplasmic reticulum is an organelle which is really just an internal network of membrane-enclosed spaces. To some degree, that's pretty much what endoplasmic reticulum means. There are two types of endoplasmic reticulum, rough and smooth. The rough ER is associated with protein synthesis because what makes it rough is that it has ribosomes embedded into its membrane. The smooth ER, or SER, is mostly concerned with storage, and calcium ions is a common thing to be stored in the smooth ER. We'll be considering the rough ER as part of the secretory pathway in cells, such as for the endocrine system, and the smooth ER will be important in muscle cells. It has a special name there, but it is the smooth ER. With the rough ER, protein synthesis and secretion is also dependent on the Golgi apparatus. The Golgi apparatus is another membrane-closed space. It's a series of discs that are separate from each other, but they make up one integrated whole in how they work together. Vesicles that leave the rough ER with synthesized proteins merge into the Golgi apparatus, and then those proteins are processed in preparation for secretion, mainly to be released from the cells. There are some things that are released from the Golgi apparatus that remain in the cell, but they're going to be transported to another part of the cell usually. And those transport vesicles from the Golgi apparatus will associate with the microtubule system in the cytoskeleton to move those vesicles to their eventual location. The most important aspect of secretion that we're going to be considering is either endocrine or exocrine functions, hormones being released or sweat, oils that are released, digestive enzymes, those sorts of things. There are two membrane-bound organelles that are important for clearing toxins and waste products out of the cell. The one pictured here is the peroxisome, which is important for reducing reactive oxygen species in the cell. And it's called a peroxisome because oxygen, which is possibly toxic in its chemical reaction with a number of things in the cell, is modified into hydrogen peroxide to become less reactive. The other organelle, which isn't pictured here, is the lysosome. The name really means eating body or breaking down body, and it's important as sort of the internal stomach of the cell. It has a lower pH, similar to the stomach, though not as low, and it has a number of digestive enzymes that can break down things. One important thing that a lysosome does is that it will merge with vacuoles that debris or pathogens have been pulled into a cell, like a white blood cell, and destroy them by digesting them. The peroxisomes are mostly associated with the liver, where detoxification takes place. And the lysosomes, like I said, are an important part of how white blood cells work.